Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive.
Yeah.
Today, we're going to be looking at the relationship between cities and climate action.
Wow.
We've got some excerpts here from the World Cities Report 2024.
Okay.
We're going to be focusing on how cities are tackling climate change, their resilience, and some of the financing solutions that are being proposed.
Right.
So by the end of this deep dive, you should have a really good understanding of the challenges that cities face, but also some of the amazing opportunities.
Absolutely.
And hopefully you can take away some insights that you can use in your own work.
Yeah, for sure.
So this report really paints a pretty stark picture of cities being right on the front lines of climate change impacts.
It does.
It doesn't pull any punches. It says that cities are highly vulnerable.
Yeah, they are.
But why is that?
Well, you got to think about it. They've got these huge populations.
Right.
And all these assets packed into relatively small areas.
Yeah.
And that just makes them incredibly susceptible to things like flooding, heat waves, storms, drought. The report highlights coastal cities in particular facing some really staggering economic risks.
Yeah.
We're talking potential trillion-dollar losses from rising sea levels.
Trillion with a T.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And it gets worse because as the world urbanizes,
Right.
more and more people are going to be living in these very vulnerable areas.
So it's just going to compound.
Exactly. And in fact, urban residents are predicted to experience much higher temperature increases than people in rural areas.
So cities are victims, but the report also points out that they're huge contributors to the problem.
Absolutely.
Isn't that a bit of a catch-22?
Yeah, a little bit. It's this kind of,
Yeah.
double-edged sword.
Yeah.
They're responsible for something like 75% of global CO2 emissions.
Wow.
So think about all the infrastructure, the buildings,
The cars.
the transportation systems. It all adds up.
75%, that's a big number.
It's huge.
Okay, so cities are both vulnerable to climate change, but also, to a large extent, causing it. So what are some of the key things that the report suggests cities can do to sort of turn things around?
One of the biggest things is this idea of transitioning to a more sustainable, low-carbon pathway.
Okay.
It's a massive task,
Yeah.
but it's absolutely essential.
Right, and we can't really talk about climate change without thinking about the issue of inequality.
Absolute.
And the report is very clear that climate change impacts the most vulnerable populations disproportionately.
It does. And it actually uses this phrase, persistent and chronic structural inequalities.
Yeah.
Which is kind of a mouthful,
Yeah,
but it really captures the issue.
it does.
That the people who contributed the least to causing this problem often bear the brunt of the impact.
Can you give me an example of what that actually looks like on the ground?
Sure, think about informal settlements, slums,
Yeah.
which often lack basic infrastructure services, making them incredibly vulnerable to things like flooding or heat waves.
Yeah.
And then add in factors like poverty, insecure, land tenure discrimination, and these communities really face an uphill battle.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. And the report also talks about climate-induced migration.
It does.
How does that add to the complexity?
Well, it adds another layer of pressure.
Yeah.
As people are displaced by climate change, they often migrate to cities,
Right.
seeking refuge and opportunity. But this puts a strain on resources and can increase vulnerability for both the migrants and the existing residents.
So it's a pretty bleak picture, but is there any good news?
There is.
Does the report offer some solutions to tackle these challenges?
It does. And it starts by recognizing the power of good urban planning and design.
So how we design our cities can actually either make them more resilient or make the problems worse.
Precisely. It's a fundamental shift in thinking,
Yeah.
moving away from just aesthetics and efficiency and starting to incorporate climate considerations into every decision.
So things like land use planning,
Yeah.
building codes, transportation systems.
It all plays a role.
So more green spaces, more parks, more trees.
Yeah, absolutely. The report really emphasizes the importance of green and blue infrastructure.
Yeah.
Imagine, walking through a city where the rooftops are green, absorbing that rainfall and reducing the risk of floods.
Yeah.
And the parks are these cool oases during heat waves.
That sounds amazing.
These natural elements, they can help mitigate climate change by absorbing CO2,
Right.
reducing that urban heat island effect, and just making the city more beautiful and livable.
Are there cities that are already doing this effectively?
Absolutely. The report highlights places like Oslo, Copenhagen, Stockholm.
Oh, wow.
They've put in place these really strong regulatory frameworks that encourage and even mandate, in some cases, low-carbon development.
Wow. So they're really showing that it can be done.
They are.
I'm curious about what the report says about infrastructure in general, because that seems like a massive and expensive undertaking.
It's key to both mitigating and adapting to climate change.
Right.
But the report challenges us to think beyond just the traditional gray infrastructure,
Mm-hmm.
the concrete and steel, and to embrace what they call blue-green solutions.
I love that term blue-green infrastructure. It's
Yeah.
very powerful.
It captures this idea of working with nature, not against it.
Yeah.
And the report also stresses the importance of community engagement in this whole process.
Oh, absolutely.
These projects are going to directly impact people's lives, so their voices need to be heard.
Right.
Infrastructure design needs to be inclusive and equitable, not just technically sound.
Yeah, that's such a good point, because resilience isn't just about the physical structures. It's about creating cities where everybody has the opportunity to thrive, no matter what their background or their circumstances are.
Exactly.
So how do we ensure that these efforts don't just benefit a select few?
Well, that's where the concept of multi-level governance comes in.
Okay.
The report really emphasizes that effective climate action can't just happen in isolation.
Right.
It requires collaboration across national, regional, and local levels.
Because it's not just about cities acting on their own. They need that support from higher levels of government.
Precisely, local governments need to be empowered with the resources and the decision-making authority to implement solutions that are tailored to their specific context.
Okay.
But they also need the backing and support of regional and national governments to make those solutions work.
It sounds like a very complex web of collaboration and coordination.
It is, but there's some great examples of cities working effectively with regional and national governments to secure funding, develop projects, and create those policies that really incentivize climate action.
Okay. So that's something that we're going to have to explore a little bit later.
Absolutely.
But let's talk about money.
Okay.
Because how do cities pay for all this?
Yeah.
Where does the money come from?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right. Or maybe in this case, the trillion-dollar question.
Yeah, exactly. Financing is one of the biggest hurdles for cities when they're trying to implement these ambitious climate action plans.
Yeah.
The report acknowledges this and dives into some potential solutions.
Okay. So what are some of those options? Where can cities go to find the resources that they need?
Well, the report really emphasizes that you need diverse financing approaches.
Yeah.
It's not just about traditional public funding.
Mm-hmm.
They need to become more creative and explore a range of options.
Give me some examples.
Okay, well, attracting private investment is one avenue. There's this growing awareness in the private sector that climate change is a real threat.
Yeah.
And investing in climate solutions can actually be profitable.
Right.
We're seeing this rise in things like green bonds, which are specifically designed to fund projects with environmental benefits.
So tapping into a wider pool of resources, not just relying on government funding?
Exactly. And another interesting idea is land value capture.
Okay.
So basically, when public investments increase the value of nearby land, like you put in a new transit line or a park,
Yeah.
the city can capture a portion of that increased value to fund other climate-related projects.
It's really clever.
Yeah, it's a way to kind of leverage public investment for an even greater impact.
So it sounds like cities can't do this alone, though, right? They need the support of national governments to make these financing mechanisms work.
Absolutely. National governments play a critical role in enabling that local climate finance.
Yeah.
They can create policies and frameworks that encourage private investment, make it easier to access funding, and provide technical assistance to help cities develop those bankable projects.
Okay, so it's a partnership. It's not just one or the other.
Oh, yes.
All right, so we've talked about financing, we've talked about partnerships and the need for these bankable projects.
Yeah.
But I want to talk about innovation now.
Sure.
Because the report also talks about how innovation is really key to driving climate action.
It's crucial.
And it's not just about technology, is it?
No, you're right. It's not just about the technology. It's also about the social and the financial innovation.
Can you give me an example of what social innovation might look like in this context?
Sure. The report highlights this really cool community-led housing initiative in Myanmar. They're incorporating climate-resilient design principles into their construction to reduce their vulnerability to extreme weather events.
Whoa.
And they're also using local materials and labor, which boosts the local economy.
So it's a win-win.
It's a great example of how social innovation can lead to these solutions that are both effective and equitable.
And the report is full of these great examples.
Oh, it is.
It highlights another one in Belo Horizonte, Brazil.
Uh-huh.
They developed this waste management solution that really empowers informal waste pickers,
Yeah,
and it's improving their livelihoods while also reducing emissions.
it's a great example.
It is a great example.
Wow.
It's these kinds of stories that I think give us hope because, it's easy to get kind of bogged down by all the negative stuff.
It is.
But when you see that real progress is being made,
Yeah.
often at the local level,
Yeah.
driven by passionate people,
Absolutely.
it's really encouraging.
It is. There's a lot of ingenuity and resilience out there.
Yeah, and it's about finding ways to sort of replicate these successes in other cities.
It's exactly.
So as we move on to the next part of our deep dive,
Okay.
what are some of the key things you think listeners should keep in mind? What are the big takeaways so far from this report?
Well, I think the main takeaway is that cities are at the heart of this challenge.
Yeah.
They face these immense challenges,
Yeah.
but they also possess this incredible potential for driving solutions.
Right.
And it's clear from the report that effective climate action in cities requires a multifaceted approach.
Yeah.
We need to rethink urban planning, embrace these innovative infrastructure solutions, find those creative ways to finance climate action,
Right.
and perhaps most importantly, foster a culture of collaboration and community engagement.
Absolutely. Cities are these complex systems, and tackling climate change within them requires this very holistic and integrated approach.
It does.
It's not about finding a single silver bullet.
Right.
It's about weaving together a tapestry of strategies that address all these interconnected challenges.
Yeah, you've got climate change, inequality, sustainable development.
Yeah, it's all connected.
It is, and that's what makes this topic so fascinating
Yeah.
and so important.
Yeah.
It's not just about saving the planet.
Right.
It's about creating a better future for everyone.
Yeah.
A future where cities are thriving, equitable, and resilient.
That's a powerful vision, and it's one that I think we can all get behind.
Absolutely.
So thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah.
We'll be back soon to explore some more of these specific challenges and solutions around climate action in cities.
Looking forward to it.
Okay, so we've talked about some of the big picture stuff, the challenges, the opportunities that cities are facing in this whole climate crisis.
Yeah.
I want to unpack some of the specific areas where action is needed.
Okay.
Where does this report suggest cities should focus their efforts?
Well, one of the areas they really zero in on is transportation.
Okay.
They call it out as a major source of emissions in cities
Right.
and say it's really critical to shift to those low-carbon alternatives.
Well, what does that look like in practice? What kind of changes are we talking about?
Well, we're talking about a pretty significant overhaul of how people and goods move around cities.
Yeah.
Investing in public transit, making cities more walkable, and bike-friendly electrifying vehicle fleets.
Those are big changes.
They are. But there are cities that are making some real progress.
Like who?
Well, Mexico City, for example, invested heavily in its Vallejo and Dosal area to create a more sustainable transportation system.
Oh, okay.
They expanded public transit, added bike lanes, and even created incentives for businesses to switch to electric vehicles.
Interesting. So they're not just focusing on reducing emissions, they're also trying to improve people's quality of life.
Exactly. And the report makes the point that sustainability and economic development don't have to be at odds.
Right.
In fact, in Mexico City's case, these investments in sustainable transportation actually attracted new businesses and boosted the local economy.
That's great. That's a win-win.
It is.
The report also talks about the importance of green spaces in cities, right? I remember that term, nature-based solutions.
Yeah, the report argues that green spaces are essential not just for climate mitigation and adaptation,
Right.
but also for the overall health and well-being of urban residents.
Of course, parks and trees make cities more pleasant places to live, but how do they actually contribute to climate action?
Well, they do it in a few ways. Firstly, they help to cool cities down, reducing that urban heat island effect,
Yeah.
which can be significant, especially during heat waves.
Right.
Secondly, they act as carbon sinks, absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere.
Okay.
And finally, they can help manage stormwater runoff, reducing the risk of flooding.
So it's about making cities more resilient to the impacts of climate change, while also making them healthier and more enjoyable places to live.
Exactly.
But are there any challenges or potential downsides to implementing these nature-based solutions?
Well, one challenge is ensuring that those benefits are equitably distributed throughout the city.
Of course.
It's important to avoid a situation where only wealthy neighborhoods have access to quality green spaces.
Yeah.
The report stresses the need for inclusive planning that ensures everyone, regardless of income or neighborhood, can enjoy the benefits of nature in the city.
Yeah, that's such an important point. We've talked a lot about equity in this deep dive,
Yeah.
and it's clear that it needs to be at the forefront of all these climate action efforts.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's talk about the elephant in the room, financing.
Okay.
The report lays out some of the financial hurdles cities face when it comes to climate action.
It does.
Can you walk us through some of those challenges?
Sure. One of the biggest challenges is that most cities simply don't have enough money to implement the scale of climate action that's needed.
All right.
This is particularly true in developing countries, where cities often face limited revenue streams, and they rely on those unpredictable disbursements from national governments.
So it's kind of a chicken and egg problem.
Yeah.
They need money to implement climate action,
Right.
but they don't have the resources to access that money in the first place.
It's a tough situation.
So what does the report suggest cities can do to break out of this cycle?
Well, one strategy is to improve their own financial management practices.
Okay.
The report suggests that cities need to really get their financial house in order, ensure they're collecting taxes efficiently
Right.
and using those funds wisely.
So it's about demonstrating financial stability
Exactly.
and responsible governance.
And the report points out that having a good credit rating can open up a lot more financing options.
Oh, okay.
It encourages cities to engage with those international credit rating agencies to showcase their financial strength and attract investors.
So building trust and demonstrating that they're a safe bet for investors.
Exactly.
What about collaboration and partnerships? Can they play a role in unlocking climate finance?
Absolutely. The report highlights the importance of cities working with regional and national governments,
Yeah.
as well as with international organizations and private sector partners.
Right.
Pooling resources, sharing expertise, and leveraging economies of scale can make those climate action projects more attractive to funders.
So it's about recognizing that no city is an island. You need to work together to tackle this global challenge.
Absolutely.
But beyond securing the funding, are there other things cities need to do to attract investors?
Yes. A key point the report emphasizes is the need to develop what they call bankable projects.
Okay.
These are projects that are well-structured, have a clear business case, and demonstrate a potential return on investment.
So investors want to see that their money is being used effectively
Exactly.
and that there's a good chance of success.
Right. It needs to make sense for them as well.
Makes sense. What are some specific financing mechanisms that cities can explore? The report mentions green bonds.
Yeah, green bonds are becoming increasingly popular.
Yeah.
But the report also dives into other options like land value capture,
Right.
where cities can use the increased property values that result from public investments like new transit lines or parks
Yeah.
to finance other climate-related projects.
Oh, that's clever. So it's about thinking creatively
Yeah.
and strategically about how to leverage existing resources.
Exactly.
But what about the role of the private sector? Can private investment play a big role in financing climate action in cities?
Absolutely. There's growing recognition in the private sector that climate change is a real threat.
Yeah.
And that investing in climate solutions can mitigate risk and create new opportunities for growth and innovation.
So it's not just about altruism. It's about smart business.
It is. But the report also points out that attracting that private investment requires clear policies and regulations from national governments that incentivize sustainable urban development.
So again, it comes back to that multi-level governance approach.
It does. It's a team effort.
Right. Okay, so we've covered financing partnerships, the need for bankable projects,
Yeah.
but I want to hear more about the human side of this whole thing.
Okay.
How does the report address the social and the equity aspects of climate action?
Well, that's a crucial point. The report makes a very strong case for what it calls a people-centered approach to climate action.
Okay.
It stresses the need to prioritize the needs and the perspectives of all residents, particularly those who are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change.
So it's not just about these technical solutions like building seawalls or installing solar panels.
Right.
It's about ensuring that those solutions actually benefit the people they're intended to help.
Exactly. And the report highlights a few key principles for achieving this.
Like what?
Well, one is ensuring that all residents have a voice in the decision-making processes.
Okay.
So creating meaningful opportunities for community engagement and ensuring that those marginalized voices are heard.
That sounds great in theory, but how does that actually work in practice? Are there cities that are doing this well?
There are some great examples. Some cities are using participatory budgeting processes to give residents a direct say in how climate action funds are allocated.
Okay.
Other cities are creating community advisory boards to provide input on climate action plans.
So finding ways to empower communities and give them a seat at the table.
Exactly. And it's not just about giving people a voice.
Right.
It's also about building local capacity.
Okay.
The report argues that Communities need to have the knowledge, the skills, and the resources to develop and implement their own climate solutions.
So empowering communities to become agents of change.
Exactly, not just passive recipients of top-down solutions.
Right. But there are also those broader social and economic issues that need to be addressed.
You're absolutely right.
Right.
The report emphasizes the need to address those underlying drivers of vulnerability.
Yeah.
Things like poverty, inequality, discrimination.
Right.
It argues that climate action needs to be integrated with those broader social and economic development goals.
It's about creating a more just and equitable society.
Exactly, not just a climate resilient one.
Right. So addressing the root causes of vulnerability.
Not just treating the symptoms.
Exactly. And the report highlights several examples of cities that are taking this holistic approach, integrating climate action with efforts to reduce poverty, improve access to education, healthcare, and create those more inclusive and equitable communities.
Those are the kinds of solutions we need.
They are. Okay, so as we move towards the final part of our deep dive,
Okay.
I want to circle back to this idea of a negotiated approach to resilience that the report champions. Can you unpack that for us? What does that actually mean?
It's this really fascinating idea that challenges those traditional top-down models of urban planning and governance.
Okay.
The premise is that resilience isn't something that can be imposed from above.
Right.
It needs to be co-created through dialogue, collaboration, and a willingness to embrace those different perspectives.
It sounds like a very messy and complex process.
It is.
Is it even realistic to think that cities can actually make this kind of collaborative approach work?
Well, it's not easy, but the report showcases several inspiring examples of cities around the world that are experimenting with these negotiated approaches to resilience.
Give me an example.
Okay, well, one compelling example is a pilot project in Pune, India.
Okay.
It's focused on developing a more climate-resilient and inclusive transportation system.
Okay. I'm intrigued.
Wow.
Tell me more about this Pune project. What makes it a good example of this negotiated approach?
Well, Pune was facing this classic urban transportation crisis.
Okay.
Traffic congestion, air pollution, lack of access to affordable and reliable transport for many residents.
Right. The usual problems.
Especially in low-income communities.
Yeah.
You know, it's a familiar story. They knew they needed to make a change.
Right.
But they also recognized that just coming up with a new plan wasn't enough.
Of course.
They needed a plan that people would actually buy into.
Right. So they needed to get the community on board.
Exactly.
How did they do that?
Well, they took a very different approach than that traditional top-down planning model.
Yeah.
They recognized that they needed to engage a wide range of stakeholders, including residents, businesses, transportation providers, experts, to develop a plan that addressed the needs and the priorities of the entire city.
It sounds like a very collaborative and inclusive process.
It was. They facilitated a series of workshops, dialogues, community meetings, where people could share their experiences, their concerns, and their ideas for a better transportation system.
I imagine those conversations were sometimes pretty difficult.
Oh, absolutely. Transportation is often a very contentious issue.
Yeah.
And people have very strong opinions about how it should work.
Yeah, of course.
And the report highlights how the Pune project didn't shy away from those difficult conversations. They acknowledged that there would be competing interests and perspectives.
Right.
And they worked to find solutions that could balance those competing needs.
So did they actually manage to come up with a plan that everybody could get behind?
Remarkably, they did.
Wow.
And what's interesting is that the plan they developed wasn't just about making the transportation system more climate resilient.
Okay.
It was also about making it more equitable and accessible for all residents.
Okay, give me some concrete examples. What did they actually decide to do?
Well, they implemented a comprehensive set of changes.
Okay.
They expanded the city's bus rapid transit system, making it more convenient and affordable for people to get around without relying on those private cars.
Okay.
They created dedicated bike lanes, making it safer and more enjoyable to cycle.
Okay.
They improved pedestrian infrastructure, making it easier and more pleasant to walk.
Great.
And they even started introducing electric vehicle charging stations to encourage the transition to cleaner transportation options.
It sounds like a very well-rounded approach addressing multiple aspects of the transportation system.
It was.
But how did they ensure that these improvements would actually benefit everyone, not just those who could already afford to drive a car or live in neighborhoods with good transportation options?
That's where the negotiated aspect really comes in.
Okay.
They worked to ensure that that new transportation infrastructure would be located in a way that connected low-income communities to those job centers, schools, and essential services. They didn't want to create a system where only wealthy residents had access to the best transportation options.
That's a really important point. It's about making sure that these climate action efforts don't actually exacerbate existing inequalities,
Yeah.
but instead help to level the playing field.
Exactly. And they also introduced fare subsidies and other programs to make public transit more affordable for those low-income residents.
Okay.
They recognized that simply building new infrastructure wasn't enough. They also needed to address those financial barriers
Right.
that could prevent people from accessing those sustainable transportation options.
So it was a very holistic approach.
Right.
They were considering both the physical infrastructure
Yeah.
and the social and economic factors that influence people's transportation choices.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes this negotiated approach to resilience so powerful.
Yeah.
It recognizes that climate action isn't just about building seawalls or installing solar panels.
Yeah.
It's about addressing the underlying systems of inequality and injustice that make some communities more vulnerable to climate change than others.
It's about creating cities that are not just resilient to these climate shocks,
Yeah.
but they're also fair and just for all residents.
Precisely. And that requires a willingness to listen, to collaborate, and to embrace the complexity and messiness of working together to create a better future.
That's a great note to end on.
Yeah.
This has been a really fascinating exploration of all the challenges and opportunities cities face in tackling climate change.
It has.
But we're not done yet.
No, we're not.
In the final part of our deep dive,
Okay.
we'll delve even deeper into some of those more nuanced aspects of urban resilience,
Great.
exploring this need for transformative adaptation and the importance of embracing uncertainty.
Looking forward to it.
Stay tuned.
Yeah.
So we've talked about so much in this deep dive.
Yeah.
You know, everything from those stark realities of climate change impacting our cities
Yeah.
to that inspiring potential for innovative solutions. But this idea of a negotiated approach to resilience,
Yeah.
I find it so powerful.
It is.
But I'm wondering how it translates into long-term transformative change.
Yeah, well, that's a great question because the report goes beyond just this idea of bouncing back from immediate shocks.
Right?
It emphasizes the need for cities to transform and adapt in the face of this ongoing change.
So it's not just about reacting. It's
Yeah.
about anticipating
Yeah.
and evolving.
It's about recognizing that climate change is a marathon, not a sprint.
Right.
Cities can't just build a seawall and say we're done.
Right.
They need to be constantly adapting to these changing conditions.
Yeah, they need to be dynamic.
Exactly. And the report uses this really great analogy to illustrate this.
Okay.
It talks about navigating a sailboat in a storm.
Oh, wow.
You can't just set your course and hope for the best. You have to constantly adjust your sails, read the wind, respond to those ever-changing conditions.
That's such a great analogy.
Yeah.
It really highlights that resilience is this active and dynamic process. It's about being flexible,
Yeah.
nimble, and responsive.
Absolutely not rigid and inflexible.
Right, and that probably requires a real mindset shift for planners and policymakers.
It does, because traditionally, urban planning has been all about trying to predict and control the future.
Yeah.
But in this world that's increasingly shaped by climate change and all these other complex challenges,
Right.
that approach just isn't feasible anymore.
So instead of trying to control the uncontrollable,
Yeah.
cities need to get more comfortable with uncertainty.
Exactly. Embrace the fact that the future is full of surprises.
But how do they do that? How do they get comfortable with that?
Well, the report advocates for a more experimental and iterative approach to urban planning.
Okay.
It's about being willing to try new things, learn from those mistakes, and adjust course along the way.
So it's like applying the scientific method to city building.
Exactly. You
Yeah.
form a hypothesis test, analyze the results, and refine your approach based on what you learn.
Right, a constant cycle of learning and adaptation.
Yeah. But that can be tough for cities, especially when you're dealing with those long-term projects and those huge infrastructure investments.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It requires a shift in thinking and a willingness to embrace those new ways of working.
But do you think this experimental approach is particularly valuable when tackling climate change?
I do, because we're dealing with such complex and unpredictable systems.
So we need to be able to adapt quickly.
Exactly. We need to embrace that fail fast, learn fast mentality
Yeah.
and accept that there isn't always a perfect solution right out of the gate.
So be willing to experiment
Exactly.
and iterate along the way.
Yeah, and the report really emphasizes the importance of creating a culture where failure is seen as a learning opportunity, not a setback.
It's not a bad thing to fail.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
And that applies not just to planners and policymakers,
Right.
but also to residents and communities.
Can you give me an example of what that might look like in practice?
Sure, imagine a city that encourages its residents to experiment with different ways to reduce their carbon footprint. So, they could set up those community composting initiatives,
Mhm.
create rooftop gardens, launch carpooling networks.
Yeah.
The key is to create this environment where people feel empowered to try new things,
Right.
share what they learn, and collectively work towards a more sustainable future.
So turning the entire city into a living lab.
Exactly, a living lab for sustainability.
I love
A
that.
great way to think about it. And it's not just about those technologies and the infrastructure.
Right.
It's about those behaviors and those mindsets as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what this report is really arguing for,
It is.
is that this kind of transformative approach to resilience,
Yeah.
it's essential for cities to not only survive, but to thrive in the face of climate change.
It is.
It's using climate change as that catalyst for positive change
For rethinking how we design, build, and manage our cities.
and recognizing that those challenges of climate change are interconnected
Yeah.
with those broader social, economic, and environmental issues.
Absolutely. It's about creating cities that are not just climate resilient,
Yeah.
but also more equitable, just, and sustainable overall.
That's a powerful vision and one that I think really resonates with what we've been discussing
Totally.
throughout this entire deep dive.
Me too. This report really highlights those immense challenges cities face,
Yeah.
but also that incredible potential for transformation and innovation.
And it really underscores the importance of taking that collaborative and inclusive approach.
It does.
Recognizing that everyone has a role to play in shaping a more resilient future.
Absolutely. As you go about your day, think about those small actions you can take,
Yeah.
the conversations you can have, and the choices you can make to contribute to that more resilient future for your city and for our planet.
That's such a great message to leave our listeners with.
Yeah.
This deep dive has been so insightful.
It has.
It's been so inspiring, and I really hope it encourages our listeners to think differently about the role they can play in creating a more sustainable and resilient future.
It's been a pleasure diving into this topic with you.
Thank you for joining us. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a better world.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Until next time.